This question comes from a viewer. What if school was optional? How would the world be different? Most of us went to school because it was compulsory. And even in places where education is free and readily available, there's still a stigma against dropping out. In countries like Finland, the Netherlands, and Japan, education is free and almost everyone stays in school until they are at least 16 years old. Even though the majority of people in these countries do continue on to college, there's a small percentage that opts out of school to pursue other opportunities. So there is some truth to the idea that everyone should have the freedom to decide what kind of education they want to receive. But up until now, we've chosen to live in societies where this isn't the case. In the United States, students are required by law to attend school between the ages of 6 and 16. Those who do and comply risk fines or other penalties. We've all been told that education is mandatory and that there are serious consequences for not following those rules. But what if things were different? What if school was completely optional? To start, it might sound like a great opportunity for those who dislike school. At the very least, you would see a rise in travel vloggers and YouTube channels, because why would anyone sit inside a classroom when they could go explore the world? But this idea is nothing new. It's been around since the early days of the United States. John Holt was a prominent advocate of this idea who wrote several books about unschooling, which is an approach to education that rejects the traditional school system altogether. He believed that children learn best by doing, and that the traditional classroom setting often gets in the way of that process. Unschooling families typically focus on providing their children with a rich set of experiences that can foster a love of learning rather than adhering to a strict curriculum. This approach has its critics who argue that it can lead to a lack of structure and discipline, and that it may not adequately prepare children for the demands of higher education or the workforce. However, unschoolers point to studies that suggest that children who are homeschooled tend to perform well academically and socially. But what if we took this idea to the extreme and made school completely optional? Well, first off, the government wouldn't be able to collect taxes from parents who wanted to pull their kids out of school. They might try to incentivize keeping kids in school by offering tax breaks to those who do so. But ultimately, your decision about whether to send your kid to school or not would be up to you. You could keep them home and homeschool them yourself, send them to a private school, or enroll them in a public one. But there would be no penalty for opting out. Now, let's say that you didn't send your kid to school. Would they be allowed to get a job? Well, this is where things get complicated. On the one hand, work is essential for a lot of reasons, including financial stability, personal fulfillment, and social integration. On the other hand, requiring kids to work could put them in harm's way. There are countless stories about young people being exploited in dangerous or exploitative work environments. Not to mention that having kids work would take away from the pool of workers that is available to those who are older and arguably more capable. So there would likely be laws against allowing kids to work, at least in most places. If you did want your kid to work, you could always start a family business. Most business owners aren't just looking for someone to fill a role. They're looking for someone who can help them achieve a vision. So as long as your kid was competent enough to fill whatever role you had in mind, they would be able to get a job. Now, whether or not they got paid much would depend on how competitive the market was. If not many people were getting educated, then there would be plenty of jobs available for those who chose to work. Conversely, if most people continued to go to school, then there would be less competition for jobs and potentially higher wages. So let us assume that you have a kid who doesn't go to school but wants to get a job. Where would they go to learn the necessary skills? Well, this is where things start to get interesting. When schools become optional, the entire education industry would be turned on its head. Rather than relying on schools to teach kids the basics, parents would need to find alternative ways to educate their children. Some might opt for homeschooling, while others might choose to enroll their kids in online courses. There would also be a growing demand for tutors and educational services, creating a whole new industry of educational entrepreneurs. Now, if you wanted your kid to learn advanced concepts, you might send them to a private academy, sort of like an after-school program. These academies would be specialized and cater to small groups of kids. Because of this, they would be expensive, but if your kid was talented enough, they would eventually be able to get a job and pay for their own education. That is, unless companies started requiring diplomas as a prerequisite for applying. In that case, the government would have to step in and regulate what constituted an acceptable form of education. Otherwise, those who had been educated outside of school would be at a disadvantage when applying for jobs. The thing is, we're living in a time of rapid technological change. There is a good chance that many of the jobs that will exist in 20 years don't even exist today. With automation becoming more prevalent, the ability to learn new skills quickly and adapt to change will become increasingly important. So it might be better for kids to have more freedom in terms of what they learn and when they learn it. After all, there are countless examples of successful people who dropped out of school. Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, and Mark Zuckerberg are just a few names that come to mind. Of course, there are probably hundreds of thousands of people who dropped out of school and never really accomplished much. But that's the thing about giving people freedom. Some will use it to accomplish great things while others will make poor decisions. This brings us back to the original question. What if school was completely optional? To be honest, we don't know for sure. But if history has taught us anything, it's that people will always find a way to learn. Even if your parents didn't go to school, they probably learned enough to be able to teach you the basics. And as long as there are people willing to teach and others who are willing to learn, there will be knowledge being passed on. Now, this isn't necessarily a good thing for everyone involved. Just think about how many people go to college just because they feel like they have to, but they aren't really interested in what they're learning. If school was optional, then there would be fewer people going to college, which would mean fewer graduates and fewer people who are qualified for certain jobs. This could potentially lead to a decline in industries that rely on highly educated workers, which could have ripple effects throughout the economy. Not to mention that not everyone has access to the same opportunities and resources. Some people might not have the luxury of being able to stay at home while they try to figure themselves out. So making school optional could widen the gap between the rich and the poor. But even if we ignore all of the downsides, it's unlikely that school will become completely optional anytime soon. For starters, many schools are funded through taxes. Making school optional would mean less money coming into these schools, which could lead to lower quality education. Additionally, there are many people who benefit from the current system. Teachers, administrators, school board members, and politicians all have a vested interest in keeping things the way they are. That is not to say that they read all bad people who are intentionally trying to hold others back. It is just that they are not likely to support a movement that could threaten their own jobs and livelihoods. Still, it's worth considering what a world without compulsory education would look like. It would certainly be a world that was vastly different from the one we live in today. If you grew up in a household that valued education, then you probably benefited from the system being the way it is. But for those who didn't have the same advantages, things could have been very different. Ultimately, it's up to each individual to decide what path they want to take in life. But in order to do that, they need to be aware of the options that are available to them. And one of those options is to reject the traditional education system and forge their own path. That's all for today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.